Hello and welcome to another SonicLAB. Today we're looking at the MakeNoise Zero Coast, or No Coast. I think I'll call it No Coast, it just sounds easier to say to me. What is the No Coast? Well, No Coast is essentially a reference to whether it's East or West Coast synthesis. MakeNoise are used to, probably well known for making more of your sort of West Coast type synthesis modules, and the idea behind this one was to create something that was sort of platform agnostic or synthesis agnostic. East Coast synthesis is more your classic subtractive synthesis, which is VCO into a VCF, which we then filter down, ADSR and other modulators, whereas West Coast is more complex harmonically rich oscillators with modulatable parameters to create harmonically rich sounds, and a low pass gate which kind of has a specific type of sound. So the No Coast, what is it? Well, it's essentially a little desktop synthesizer. This is it here. Nice metal box, external power supply, which is a 15 volts, comes with all the various different attachments that you would need. Comes with 4 patch cables. I don't know whether you had a pink one, 2 white ones and 2 pink ones. Also, the MIDI input, it's got a MIDI to CV converter on it, which comes in the usual form, which is a mini jack input and a DIN input. This follows the same standard as the Novation and also the Arturia, so you can, if you lose this thing, you can always use one of those if you like. And essentially it's a fully modular synthesizer, but it's sort of normaled as well. So all the normaling follows these gold lines. So the gold lines basically indicate where it goes to. So you've got your classic MIDI input, or you can patch your CV input directly. MIDI input goes to the pitch oscillator, and then the gate comes out and goes into triggering the contour, which is probably easier to think of as a standard envelope, but it's got a few tricks of its own. And we've also got a little slope generator, which is like a second envelope, but also can be set to cycle by pressing that button, so then it will cycle and loop. And that is normaled to the complex oscillator. Now the complex oscillator part is the sort of wave folding on a harmonic generator, and the oscillator generates a triangle wave and a square wave, which are both fed into here, and then the harmonics are added with the overtone, and then they're multiplied with this here. So if I just now unpatch everything and come back to the naked synthesizer, if you like, we can just listen to an oscillator. I'll take the dynamics down to about 12 o'clock. So you can see the gate is triggering the envelope. We've got these really nice little sort of backlit LED panels which sort of help you understand what's going on. The contour envelope is hardwired to the dynamics, which is essentially the low pass gate. So that we're just listening to the pure triangle wave at the moment, which has plenty of girth, I might add, nice and meaty. Now if I patch, say, the square wave directly in, we can listen to the square wave on its own. And it has a very wide frequency range, the oscillator. We've got fine pitch here, then there's a linear FM modulation source here with we can dial in the amount of amplitude. So now if I bring the low pass gate, drive that harder, you can hear, as well as making it louder, it makes it brighter. And that's kind of the filtery style or type behavior. So really, I mean, I would say, or even though they say it's a No Coast, I would say this is more of a West Coast kind of style. So in many ways, it's actually a little more difficult to understand straight out of the box if you're used to subtractive synthesis, but it's capable of some very interesting sound. It's a great way to get into some West Coast action. So that's the square wave. I should also point out that over here, we've got other sections as well. We've got the ability to, we've got a built-in tempo, which we can tap, so we can generate a clock signal, and there's also a random voltage generator here, and there's this attenuverter here, which you can basically mix between 2 signals in positive and negative and you've got 2 outputs, so you've got a simple mult. So it's a very useful part of circuitry here indeed. There's some various different modes that you can access. I'll go in a little bit more on at the moment, because what I'm using here, there's a second CV output, which at the moment is set to be an LFO. Which you set up in the MIDI pages. I can tap the tempo of the LFO. That's a triangle output, that is a square output, but as I say, more on that later. So let's listen to the oscillators and the complex oscillator as well. I've got a close-up here of the pitch. One of the questions that came in, I did ask for questions, was can I listen to a sweep of what's the range of the basic oscillator? So if I start down here, sweep it right up, so my lowest oscillator pitch is not into the subsonic kind of LFO territory. That's still in audible range, but it does go up very high. That's about as high as it goes. It's quite piercing. Actually, it is possible to get this to go down into LFO ranges. You do it like this. Using this math section, which is essentially when there's nothing plugged in, you just generate a positive or negative voltage. If you plug something into the right hand side, you can positively and negatively invert it. It's a 10-uverter, and it will sum the two into the output. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to take the output of this and go into the volt per octave, press a note, taking it right down. Definitely gets me into LFO ranges, so I get the full range, and I can go quite low, so I can use this as an LFO if I wish. Right, so now let's listen to the complex oscillator. I've also asked in the comments, could I get this up on the scope, which, as if by magic, yes I can. So here's the scope. We'll start with dynamics down at about 50%. So this is unaffected, so no overtones and no multiply. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the overtones up. You can see that's a sort of like a kind of blunt triangle wave. And if I were to take the dynamics down, it gets more blunt, even more towards a sine. If I take it up, it starts to get a bit more like a kind of, more like a sharper triangle. So let's go round. So we're bringing the multiply around. We're bringing all those additional harmonics in. And it creates quite a complex waveform, almost to a sort of like a hairy triangle, I think, as Chris Randall coined the phrase. So we'll take that down to here, then we'll bring the overtones up. Now the overtones are harder to hear when you haven't got any multiplication, but if we bring it round, it starts to get into a kind of, if I turn that up a bit, you can see the amplitude, starts to get into more of a classic triangle, then it gets into, it looks a bit like a shark tooth, which is a sort of mogi type thing, and then right round into this kind of weird intervaled up and down sawtooth. Now if we bring the multiplication of the multiply that up a bit, and we start to get some really unusual sounds. If I bring that down through with full overtones, you can see that we start to get really much more complex waveforms here. It sort of sounds a little bit like a sync sweep, but that's because I think it's adding all these harmonics. So there you have the oscillator. I mean, it's definitely got a flavour. It's got plenty of bottom end, and it does add all of that additional multiplication of tones. In fact, if we look here, we can modulate the multiply, which is normal to the slope, and we got patchable overtones. One thing I would say, that because this is an attenuverter, there's no centre dent. So what I've actually done here is I've plugged in a sort of floating patch cord to make sure that there's no signal coming into this, because there's no centre dent on this. It's pretty hard to guarantee that there's no signal coming in apart from by ear, and it is quite a sensitive knob, this one. Now again, this can be modulated. In fact, it's normaled from the slope. We'll get onto that in a bit. Let's come back here and just listen to a square wave, because it's just an easier wave to understand. So contour is simple envelope. So the envelope, if you could think, that's just sustain. Onset is attack. And then we've got decay / release. You can modulate the decay parameter, which is kind of nice. And as we say, the gate is normal to trigger this envelope, and this is normal to the dynamics. Now what's interesting about this is we've got basically it's logarithmic and exponential behavior. So I'll try and explain this. It's a little bit complex. So if I take the sustain down, so eventually I've just got, this is a fairly simple, so that's your attack portion and that's the sustain decay release. So in this mode it's more like your standard shape. If I bring it round to this way, the shape changes more to this, which is logarithmic. So it's much longer and the behavior is kind of different. If I now bring it round the other way, it starts to go into exponential, which means it's doing this. So you're getting a different shape. So it's quite flexible in terms of envelopes. And then when you bring maybe the low pass gate in, you can get some really snappy. So this is a more traditional sort of envelope type thing. You can get a sort of almost a wub type thing if that's what you're after. Right, so bringing it round this way, we're starting to hear the blend between these two waves. Now, next part is slope. Now slope is quite interesting because it's essentially like another type of envelope. And I take the trigger out here. So I'm triggering this like it's a one shot, so an envelope. So now what that's doing via this attenuverter, which is positive and negative amount of modulation of this parameter. Again, what this is doing is changing between logarithmic and linear, so we get different characteristics, and that's modulating the multiply normalized. But what I can do is switch this into cycle mode, so now it'll be like an LFO effectively. So now if I show you on the scope again what this means, play a note here. I've got a fairly standard kind of logarithmic effect. If I bring this up to here, it starts to look like a regular triangle. Bringing it further around changes the curve again, so you get more spiky. If I turn this one right down, bring it back round, I've got a ramp down, doing the opposite, gives me a ramp up, and then I can change the curve with the exponential and logarithmic. So it's also possible to make this do a square wave. I'll show you how you do this. What we do is, instead of coming out of the slope output, which gives us the full shape of the slope, we come out of the EOC, which is end of cycle, which gives us more of a basically on-off voltage, i.e. a square wave. So I'm plugging this in here. There's my square. I can change the duty cycle by changing rise and fall. So if I change the rise, we start to get into a kind of pulse width. I just adjust the pitch there slightly because it does adjust both at the same time, all the way around till we've got essentially 10% or whatever. If I come around the other way and I adjust the fall, we go into this shape of pulse width. So that's most of the waves covered. If you want a random voltage, you could use the random voltage generator, which has an output here, which is actually clocked from the master tempo of the device, so which I can set by clicking, tap tempoing the program A button, or it can take an external trigger input. But that was only modulating the actual waves and the overtones and the folding. I could also use the FM linear input from the output of the slope in audio rate mode. So if I were to patch the output of here into the linear FM, I'm starting to get FM of my oscillator, so lots of potential. When you're thinking if you're going in terms of mults, you could do a lot of things here. So I could take, if I wanted to split that out of there. So let's bring all of this together into a more complex patch. What I've got here is the Beatstep Pro. I'm running 2 channels, so the first one is blue, so CV and gate. It's coming out, so I've got gate going into the trigger for the contour and CV coming out into the volt per octave of the oscillator. So now if I play my sequence, just a simple line, this is just unaffected now, so I know we're listening to just the output of the wave shaper. So if I now, obviously I've got reverb and delay on it. What I've also got is the clock coming out of the Beatstep Pro driving the tempo, which is then in turn driving the sample and hold waveform here, which is in turn coming from into the attenuverter. I'm going negative and out and into the overtone parameter. So now I've got if I bring up the dynamics, so I've also got the output here, which is a triangle wave LFO, which you can access via the pages, which I'll show you a bit later. And I've got that coming into the FM linear modulation. So I can add a little bit of modulation to the basic oscillator. What I've also got, if I swing this round, I've got the second CV out coming into the time of the slope. So what I'm effectively doing is modulating the time of the slope. It only works over about an octave, but I'm able to now I'm also re-triggering the envelope when I trigger any additional notes by using a little stackable cable here. But I've got some additional modulation going on. So what I can do here is I've also got the output of the slope coming into the multiply. Turn up the dynamics here, it gets pretty gnarly. So that's a more complex patch there with lots of different routing possibilities. Obviously we've got lots of modulation options, including tuning down the VCO into LFO ranges. The slope, which I've shown you how to do, which does go to very high audio rates, or in the modes here, the program MIDI modes, you can set the extra gate and CV outputs here, which are on MIDI B, to be an LFO output, as I say, triangle wave and also a square wave, and that's hit tap tempo on program A. Now, like for instance here, I've got the LFO coming in to change the overtones. So So you can get some additional LFO action there. And this opens up a bit more of the sort of under the hood stuff, which is a little more complicated to get to. So I'll just show you how I understand it. I mean, it is a bit cryptic, I must say. So to enter the pages mode, the sort of menu mode, you press and hold A, then you get these two flashing, and then you page through up to 7 times, and that's what's going on is sort of signified by whether that's flashing, whether that's lit. To be honest, it's a bit cryptic, but it allows you to do things like assign a separate MIDI channel to this gate and CV output. This could be mapped to note number or velocity or mod wheel and stuff like that. But honestly, I have to confess, I found it a little bit difficult to use. To exit that mode, press and hold. I did speak to MakeNoise, and what they said was they were thinking about either creating an editor so you could access that more easily, but I think it sort of goes against the spirit of it. I think what would make more sense is to maybe just have a series of program changes that you could send to the unit that would set those modes as you want. So that way you could reconfigure partially the unit, you know, maybe on the fly, so that could be quite handy. But as it comes, I also should mention there's an arpeggiator here as well. And to enter the arpeggiator, to switch it on, you press and hold program A and B at the same time. And to exit it, you press and hold again. Now, it plays purely the notes in the order that they are input. And also it latches and non-latching, but that involves the combination of button presses that I'm afraid I just could not get the hang of, but you can have it in not latching and non-latching mode. So that does give you some extra functionality. And also, I think probably the most handy thing is this LFO mode. I think that's actually quite useful because you can use that for a number of things. You can use, say, the gate output to clock the master tempo. So for instance, you could set the whole tempo there, then you'd have an LFO and the clock source synced, and then also the random voltage as well. So, you know, things like that make this quite sort of fascinating to use. So far, I've been playing things from a keyboard. I just wanted to, there was a generative patch that I did because a lot about West Coast synthesis that I've seen anyway, examples of, are about machines that can kind of self-generate sound. So here's a quick patch that I did earlier. So that was a more sort of rhythmic sequence using the random voltage and modulating the decay setting just to create this kind of like sequency sort of clock type thing. Obviously you can slow things right down and create more sort of ambient textures as well. There was some questions in the comments that I posted for this kind of preview video I did of this, which was can it do a bass sound? So here's a bass sound with a sort of sweep. So some more sounds there. I mean, the one thing I would say though, while it is a kind of standalone desktop type synthesizer, you really do have to apply your sort of modular brain to it. The kind of level of patching and all the complexity that you can get with this really does mean that you can, to get the most out of it, you need to think in a more modular sort of mindset. Having said that though, the fact that it is very modular means that it's going to integrate nicely with, say, a Mother 32 or other Eurorack things, or maybe the Arturia things. You know, you have a lot of audio rate modulation stuff in here, which is not something you find in a traditional East Coast system. So that's sort of more on the West Coast side. Having said that though, you don't necessarily get, in most West Coast systems, you don't get ADSR. So that's a big concession to the East Coast side of things. So I think it does kind of deserve the no coast moniker for its pathway between the two disciplines. It's going to be about 450 UK pounds, which is around about $500. I suspect the pound price is likely to increase just because of the recent changes in the exchange rate. So if you find one at that price in the UK, I'd snap it up at the moment. But basically, if you want to get into A, modular, and B, a more West Coast kind of centric type way of looking at things, then this is pretty much the only game in town. The fact that it's standalone and it's affordable are two major plus points. So that's it. Thank you very much for watching. That has been SonicLAB looking at the MakeNoise Zero Coast. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe.